My name is Meredith. I am 32 years old, and by trade, I am a senior data analyst for a risk assessment firm. My entire professional life is built on observing patterns, identifying anomalies, and predicting the exact moment a structure will fail. I deal in numbers, probabilities, and cold, hard facts. Perhaps that is why I never viewed my marriage as a romance. I viewed it as an extended period of data collection. The sting on my left cheek was still fresh, radiating a sharp, localized heat that contrasted violently with the air-conditioned chill of the grand ballroom. But it was the silence of the 550 elite guests gathered in that Connecticut estate that was truly deafening. It was a thick, suffocating quiet, the kind that follows a multi-car collision before the sirens begin to wail. It was our third wedding anniversary. The crystal chandeliers above us fractured the light into thousands of tiny, blinding prisms, casting a sickly glow over the sea of tuxedos and designer gowns. A moment before, my father-in-law, Conrad, had tapped his spoon against his baccarat champagne flute. The chiming sound had cut through the low hum of old money chatter. He raised his glass, not to me, the woman sitting at the head table, but to Vivian. A woman who was currently seated 3 chairs down, wearing a dress that cost more than most people's annual salary, sporting a smile that was equal parts predatory and triumphant. Conrad had toasted to the future of our family lineage, to a new and more noble addition to their aristocratic bloodline. I didn't cry. I didn't gasp. I simply placed my linen napkin on the table, the fabric meticulously folded, and stood up to politely object to my own public erasure. That was when my husband, Vance, stood up beside me. He didn't look me in the eye. He looked at his father. Then, he adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Italian suit, turned, and struck me across the face. A sharp, loud slap designed not just to hurt, but to put me back in my place. To show the room, and more importantly his father, that he was in control. I didn't scream. I didn't raise a hand to cradle my stinging cheek. The room held its collective breath, waiting for the hysterical breakdown of the lower-class girl who had overstepped her bounds. Instead, I calmly pushed my half-empty crystal water glass to the side. I reached into my evening clutch, pulled out my phone, and opened a text thread with my father, Harrison. The man they had spent 3 years mocking as a grease-stained mechanic. The man they called a bottom feeder. I typed exactly 3 words. Initiate Article 4. I pressed send. The tiny swoosh sound of the message departing was swallowed by the heavy silence of the ballroom. They didn't know it yet, standing there in their tailored arrogance, but 72 hours from that exact second, the century-old real estate empire of the Vance family would be reduced to a cloud of legal dust. Before I take you into the cold calculations, the passive-aggressive wars, and the fake diamonds that led to that moment, make sure to subscribe to the channel. This isn't just a story about a broken marriage, it's a blueprint of an empire's autopsy. Stay with me. The rot didn't start in that ballroom. It had been festering under the floorboards for years, masked by the scent of expensive cedar and lemon polish. If you want to understand how a skyscraper collapses, you don't look at the roof. You look at the foundation. And the foundation of my life with Vance was built entirely on a carefully choreographed theater of humiliation. It was during our first year of marriage that the Sunday dinners at the family estate in the Hamptons became mandatory. The house itself was a monstrosity of Georgian architecture, designed specifically to make anyone walking through its massive oak double doors feel small. The foyer smelled perpetually of fresh lilies and old paper money. I remember the second Sunday of October with crystalline clarity. The dining room table was a sprawling expanse of polished mahogany, set for 6, but feeling vast enough to seat 20. The silver cutlery felt heavy and cold in my hands. Evelyn, my mother-in-law, sat at the opposite end of the table. She was a woman who spoke entirely in micro-expressions and backhanded gestures. Her smile never quite reached her eyes. It hovered around her mouth, tightly controlled, like a velvet rope keeping the commoners at bay. Halfway through the course of roasted lamb and mint reduction, Evelyn signaled the maid with a subtle flick of her wrist. The maid returned carrying a large, heavy, forest green box tied with a pristine cream ribbon. "A little something for you, Meredith," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with the kind of saccharine sweetness that usually coats poison. "To help you settle into your proper role." I untied the ribbon. The silk slid through my fingers. I lifted the lid, pushing aside the crisp layers of branded tissue paper. Nestled inside was a Gucci kitchen apron. It was a ridiculous object, a piece of canvas and leather that had no business being near a stove, stamped violently with the interlocking GS. "I noticed you don't have domestic staff for your own kitchen yet," Evelyn continued, taking a slow, deliberate sip of her Pinot Noir. "I thought this might make your chores feel a bit more civilized. A woman should always look presentable, even when scrubbing pots, don't you agree?" I didn't flinch. I ran my thumb over the stiff leather trim of the apron. It was a calculated insult, a deliberate framing. She wasn't giving me a gift. She was handing me a uniform. She was establishing the hierarchy. In her eyes, and in the eyes of everyone in that room, I was not an equal partner to her son. I was the hired help he had mistakenly married. "Thank you, Evelyn," I said, my voice perfectly level, my heart rate steady at a calm 65 beats per minute. "It is remarkably practical." I folded the tissue paper back over it and set the box on the floor. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my career. Defending yourself to people who have already determined your worth is a waste of oxygen. Instead, I cataloged the interaction. I filed it away in the architectural blueprint of their psychology I was building in my mind. Vance, sitting to my right, didn't say a word. He kept his eyes locked on his plate, meticulously cutting his lamb into perfectly uniform, bite-sized squares. He was a man utterly terrified of his own shadow, but more terrified of his parents' disapproval. His silence was his complicity. He was a passenger in his own life, content to let his father drive, even if the car was running me over. Conrad, at the head of the table, wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and chuckled. A deep, rumbling sound that vibrated with unearned authority. "Well, she comes by it honestly," Evelyn, Conrad said, leaning back in his antique chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He didn't look at me. He looked at Vance. After all, her father spends his days up to his elbows in engine grease. What's his name again? Harrison? Still running that little garage in Delaware? Tell me, Meredith, does he still charge by the hour, or has he upgraded to flat rates for oil changes? Conrad laughed again. It was a loud, booming sound. A second later, Vance joined in. It was a weak, sycophantic laugh. It was the sound of a son desperate to align himself with the alpha male of the room, even at the expense of his wife's dignity. I picked up my fork. I pierced a single, roasted asparagus spear. The silver tines scraped faintly against the bone china. I chewed slowly, tasting the butter and the sea salt, allowing the metallic echo of their laughter to wash over me. I didn't feel anger. Anger is erratic. It clouds judgment. I felt a profound, chilling clarity. They looked at me and saw a weak, working-class girl trying to play dress-up in their world. They looked at my father and saw a man with dirt under his fingernails and a blue-collar vocabulary. They believed that wealth was loud. They believed that power was something you wore, like a bespoke suit or a designer apron, or something you drove, parked ostentatiously in a circular driveway. They had no idea. As Vance laughed along with his father, blindly agreeing with the mockery, my mind drifted to a fireproof floor safe hidden beneath the floorboards of my childhood bedroom back in Delaware. Inside that safe was a thick, manila envelope. Inside that envelope were layers of legal documents, routing numbers, and holding company structures. And at the bottom of it all, signed in heavy black ink by my father's greasy, oil-stained hands, was the master deed to a shadow corporation that held the primary debt to Conrad's most prized commercial developments. My father was not just a mechanic. He was a predator who had spent 40 years quietly buying the ground beneath their feet. Vance wiped a tear of mirth from his eye, entirely oblivious to the fact that his father's empire was already a house of cards, and I was the one holding the fan. He sat there, smiling his hollow, rehearsed smile. He didn't know that the yellow envelope sitting in the dark miles away would one day become the most expensive piece of paper in his entire life. The dinner continued, the wine flowed, and I sat in silence, collecting my data, waiting for the perfect moment to close the loop. The glass and steel monolith we occupied in Westport was not a home. It was a carefully curated exhibition of the Alden family's generational wealth. Every surface was either imported marble, brushed steel, or reclaimed walnut. The air inside was climate-controlled to a perpetual, sterile 68 degrees, smelling faintly of ozone and Evelyn's preferred diptyque candles. It was a house that abhorred mess, both physical and emotional. In the weeks leading up to our third wedding anniversary, that sterile silence grew so heavy it felt like atmospheric pressure pressing against my eardrums. If you want to understand how a skyscraper collapses, you never look at the roof. You look at the foundation. You look for the hairline fractures in the concrete, the microscopic rust on the rebar. For the Alden Empire, those fractures began to show not in the boardroom, but in the subtle, involuntary shifts in Vance's daily routines. He was operating on a frequency of low-level, continuous panic, poorly masked as executive exhaustion. I could trace the exact trajectory of his anxiety by the millimeter drop in the Baccarat crystal decanter on his studies bar cart. He had transitioned from a single, leisurely pour of Macallan in the evenings to 3 aggressive, neat glasses before he even took off his tie. He stopped making eye contact. Whenever we sat across from each other at the massive dining table, his gaze would slide off my shoulder, fixating instead on the geometric patterns of the Persian rug or the sharp corners of the minimalist art on the walls. He was a man carrying a secret he lacked the architectural integrity to support. I didn't hire a private investigator. I didn't stoop to checking his phone while he slept or sniffing his collar for foreign perfume. I am a data analyst. I deal in telemetry in the silent, objective truth of numbers. I simply sat in my home office, bathed in the cool blue light of my 3 monitors, and followed the money. The Alden Group was a privately held entity, shielded from public shareholder scrutiny, but the ecosystem that sustained them was not. I began tracking the secondary and tertiary metrics. I looked at the contractors working on their crown jewel, the Hudson Towers project, a massive, 90-story residential behemoth going up in the heart of Manhattan. The first red flag was a public lien filed by their primary steel supplier. Then, the boutique landscaping firm contracted for the rooftop terraces quietly adjusted their quarterly earnings projections downward, citing protracted payment schedules from a primary client. The Alden Empire was bleeding out from 1,000 invisible cuts. Conrad had over-leveraged the entire company. Driven by his insatiable narcissism, he had bet a century-old legacy on a single, monumentally expensive tower, and the commercial real estate market had shifted just enough to snap his fragile credit lines. According to the data models I was running at 2 in the morning while Vance slept off his scotch, the Alden Group was exactly 90 days away from total insolvency. And then, miraculously, the bleeding stopped. Overnight, the contractor liens were resolved. The aggressive emails from suppliers ceased. A sudden, massive influx of capital had been injected into the Hudson Towers accounts. I leaned closer to my monitors, the glow reflecting in my eyes, and dug into the state business registries, systematically bypassing the firewall of their shell companies. I found the source. A mezzanine loan, structured with incredibly strict, zero-tolerance clauses, had been provided by an obscure entity named Apex Holdings LLC. An angel investor. Conrad walked around the estate that weekend with his chest puffed out, smoking his Cuban cigars on the patio, genuinely believing he had outsmarted Wall Street. He thought he had found a desperate billionaire willing to hand him a lifeline. I looked at the routing numbers on the screen. I recognized the algorithmic patterns of the holding structures. Apex Holdings wasn't Wall Street. Apex was a subsidiary of a blind trust administered in Delaware. It was my father's money. Conrad had unwittingly placed his neck and his entire family's legacy directly into the jaws of the very man he mocked as a bottom feeder. And my father hadn't even had to bare his teeth to get him to do it. Conrad had walked into the trap blindfolded by his own arrogance. The corporate collapse was a fascinating case study, but the personal narrative collided with it on a quiet Tuesday morning. The private dry cleaner was scheduled to pick up the week's garments at 8. Vance had left for the city before dawn, rushing out to another emergency site meeting. In his haste, he had left his charcoal gray, bespoke Brioni suit jacket draped carelessly over the velvet armchair in his dressing room. It was an uncharacteristic mistake. Vance usually treated his wardrobe with far more reverence than he treated his marriage. I walked into the dressing room to retrieve it. The morning sunlight was slicing through the motorized blinds, illuminating the microscopic dust motes dancing in the air. I picked up the jacket. The Super 150's wool was impossibly soft, a fabric specifically engineered to whisper affluence. As I lifted it to place it on a wooden valet hanger, my fingers brushed against the inner breast pocket. I felt the sharp, rigid outline of heavy paper stock. A normal wife might have hesitated. A normal wife might have felt a sudden spike in her heart rate, a pang of guilt for invading her husband's privacy, or a wave of dread about what she might find. I felt none of those things. My resting heart rate remained at a steady 65 beats per minute. I felt only the quiet, humming efficiency of a processor receiving new data. I slid 2 fingers into the cool silk lining of the pocket and pulled out a small, heavy piece of parchment paper. It was folded precisely in half. The header was embossed in thick, silver ink. Graph. The ultra-luxury jeweler on Madison Avenue. My eyes bypassed the pleasantries of the sales associate's note and dropped straight to the itemized details. Platinum setting. 4.2-carat emerald-cut diamond. Internally flawless. The price printed at the bottom was a number that could have comfortably purchased a 4-bedroom home in a respectable suburb. The name on the billing address was Vance Alden. The name on the delivery address, however, was not mine. It was an address for a penthouse on the Upper East Side. The name attached to it was Victoria Sterling, a woman whose family money was as old, stagnant, and heavily guarded as the Aldens. She was exactly the kind of woman Evelyn and Conrad had always wanted for their son. The future of the lineage Conrad was so desperate to secure. The emerald cut was a deliberate choice, classic, old money, a stark contrast to the modern, understated band Vance had given me. The thick parchment paper felt dry and slightly coarse against my fingertips. I stood perfectly still in the dead silence of the sprawling dressing room, surrounded by rows of custom Italian leather shoes and color-coordinated silk ties. I didn't collapse onto the plush, cream-colored carpet. I didn't tear the receipt into shreds or let out a guttural scream into the void of the walk-in closet. Crying is a biological response to sudden loss, but I hadn't lost anything. I had merely gained the final, definitive piece of a puzzle I had been assembling for 3 years. I walked over to the marble-topped island in the center of the closet. I placed the receipt flat under the harsh, recessed lighting. I took out my phone, swiped to the camera, and tapped the screen to adjust the exposure. I ensured the transaction serial numbers, the date, and Victoria's name were in crisp, undeniable focus. The digital shutter made a faint, mechanical click. I folded the receipt along its original crease and slipped it back into the inner pocket of the Brioni jacket, positioning it exactly as I had found it. I hung the jacket on the rack, ready for the dry cleaner. Then I walked back to my home office. I woke up my computer and opened my heavily encrypted personal drive. I right-clicked the desktop and created a new folder. I didn't name it something dramatic, emotional, or vindictive. I named it simply Liquidation. I dragged the high-resolution photo of the diamond receipt into the folder, dropping it right next to the routing documents for Apex Holdings LLC. The files aligned perfectly on the screen. The clock was ticking down to our anniversary gala. The stage had been masterfully built, the actors were blindly rehearsing their tragic lines, and I was sitting in the dark, holding the only script that mattered. The drive from Westport to the country club in Greenwich took exactly 42 minutes. I tracked the time not because I was anxious, but because I had an affinity for the precise measurement of inevitable things. Outside the tinted windows of the town car, the Connecticut autumn had stripped the trees bare, leaving them looking like jagged black fractures against the twilight sky. Inside the car, the air was suffocatingly still. Vance sat beside me, smelling of peppermint breath mints and a heavy application of Tom Ford cologne, desperately trying to mask the sour, metallic scent of his own panic. He hadn't spoken a word since we pulled out of our driveway. His right leg bounced in a rapid, irregular rhythm, a nervous tick that vibrated through the leather seat. He was a man approaching a guillotine he had helped build. When we arrived, the valet opened my door. The November air hit my bare shoulders like a sheet of ice, but I didn't shiver. I smoothed the skirt of my dark navy, floor-length gown. It was an understated dress, deliberately devoid of sequins or ostentatious branding. In a room designed to showcase wealth, true power often dresses in camouflage. The grand ballroom of the club was a cavernous space, bathed in the warm, artificial amber glow of tiered crystal chandeliers. It smelled of roasted truffles, expensive hairspray, and the collective desperation of 550 guests who spent their entire lives pretending they had more money than they actually did. This was the Alden family's social apex, their annual gala, masquerading this year as our third wedding anniversary celebration. In reality, it was a desperate PR maneuver. A heavily choreographed illusion of stability to reassure the market that the Aldens were still royalty. I took my assigned seat at the head table. To my left was Vance, his knuckles already white around his water goblet. To his left sat Evelyn, her posture so rigidly perfect she looked as though an iron rod had been surgically implanted in her spine. And at the center, radiating a toxic, gravitational pull, sat Conrad. I mapped the room with the efficiency of a surveyor. My eyes swept over the sea of tables, identifying the key players, the creditors, the sycophants. And then, at table 4, precisely in the direct line of sight from the head table, I found her. Victoria. She was wearing a gown of spun silver, the fabric clinging to her frame like liquid metal. But it wasn't the dress that caught my attention. It was the way the light caught the 4.2-carat, emerald-cut diamond resting squarely on her left ring finger. It was the exact stone from the graph receipt currently sitting in the encrypted liquidation folder on my hard drive. She wasn't just attending the gala, she was wearing the crown jewels of Vance's betrayal openly, boldly. If you are watching this and you've ever found a piece of evidence that showed you exactly who your family really is, hit that subscribe button, like, and leave a comment. Because this story is about what happens when you stop crying and start auditing. Stay with me. The dinner service was a blur of silver cloches and synchronized waiters. I ate nothing. I simply watched the microscopic shifts in the ecosystem. I watched Victoria catch Vance's eye across the room, offering a slow, deliberate smile. I watched Vance rapidly consume 3 glasses of vintage champagne, his face growing flushed, his movements becoming erratic and uncoordinated. The architecture of his composure was crumbling under the weight of whatever Conrad had planned for the evening. At exactly 9:30, the waiters vanished. The ambient jazz music faded into total silence. Conrad stood up. He didn't clink his glass. He didn't need to. The sheer force of his arrogance commanded the room. He adjusted the lapels of his tuxedo, grabbed the microphone from the stand, and looked out over his kingdom. "Ladies and gentlemen," Conrad began, his voice a low, rumbling baritone that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "We are gathered tonight to celebrate longevity. In business, as in life, the Alden name has always stood for permanence. For legacy. We build foundations that withstand the test of time." It was a masterful opening, entirely devoid of truth. He was 90 days from bankruptcy, standing on the edge of a cliff, lecturing the birds on how to fly. "Tonight, we supposedly celebrate a 3rd anniversary," Conrad continued, his pacing slow and deliberate. He began to walk around the head table, holding the microphone. But looking to the future of the Alden Empire, I realized that true legacy isn't built on the mistakes of our past. It is built on the alliances we forge for our future. He stopped walking. He was standing directly behind Vance's chair. He didn't look at me. Not once. "An empire requires a bloodline of equal strength," Conrad's voice rose, vibrating through the massive speakers. He extended his free hand, pointing out into the crowd, pointing directly at table 4. "So tonight, I raise my glass not to the past, but to the future. To the true future of the Alden family. To a woman of unmatched grace, who understands the weight of our legacy. To Victoria." The silence that fell over the room wasn't just quiet, it was a physical entity. It was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. 550 people stopped breathing simultaneously. Conrad had just publicly erased our marriage. He had announced his son's divorce and new engagement in the middle of our anniversary gala. He had done it to humiliate me, to assert total dominance over his son, and to secure Victoria's family money, which he desperately needed to cover the bleeding holes in his portfolio. I turned my head slowly and looked at Vance. He was staring at the tablecloth, his chest heaving, sweat beading on his forehead. He had known. Of course he had known. But he had been too much of a coward to tell me. I didn't feel my throat tighten. My eyes remained perfectly dry. My resting heart rate held steady. I placed my linen napkin on the table, aligning the edges parallel to my silver dessert spoon. And then, moving with slow, deliberate precision, I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs scraped loudly against the marble floor, a sharp, abrasive sound that sliced through the dead silence of the ballroom. I stood up. I didn't intend to yell. I didn't intend to cause a scene. I merely intended to walk out of the structural failure they called a family. But my movement, my refusal to sit there and absorb the public execution, triggered something in Vance. The panicked, cornered animal inside him snapped. He needed to prove to his father that he was in control. He needed to show the room that he could manage his mistake. Vance sprang from his chair. He moved too fast, knocking his crystal water goblet over. It shattered against a silver tray. Before I could turn fully toward the exit, he closed the distance between us. His hand came through the air in a blurred arc. The slap was a sickening, meaty sound that echoed off the crystal chandeliers. It hit my left cheek with the force of a heavy door slamming shut. My head snapped to the side. A sharp, localized heat bloomed across my skin, followed instantly by the metallic taste of copper in my mouth where my teeth had caught the inside of my cheek. Someone in the back of the room gasped. A few chairs scraped as uncomfortable guests shifted. But nobody moved to intervene. Wealth protects wealth, and in their eyes, the hired help was just being disciplined. I slowly turned my head back to face him. Vance was breathing heavily, his eyes wide, his hand still hovering in the air. He looked terrified. He was waiting for the tears. He was waiting for me to collapse, to run away crying, validating his dominance. I gave him nothing. I looked at him with the cold, sterile detachment of a mortician examining a corpse. I saw right through his bespoke suit, right through his generational wealth, down to the pathetic, hollow core of his existence. I didn't raise my hand to my cheek. I reached out and picked up my small, black silk clutch from the table. The metallic clasp snapped open with a sharp click. I reached inside and pulled out my phone. The screen illuminated my face in a pale, blue light. I opened the messaging app. I selected the thread labeled H. With absolute, unwavering calmness, my thumb moved across the digital keyboard. I didn't type a paragraph of anger. I didn't ask for help. I typed the code we had agreed upon the day I discovered the Apex Holdings documents in the floor safe. Initiate Article 4. I pressed send. I watched the little green bubble appear. I locked the screen and slid the phone back into my clutch. I looked at Conrad, who was staring at me with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. Then I looked back at Vance. The check, I whispered, my voice so low that only he could hear it over the deafening silence of the room, is going to bounce. I turned my back on the 550 guests, on the crystal chandeliers, and on the Alden Empire, and I walked out of the ballroom. My heels clicked rhythmically against the marble floor, echoing like the steady ticking of a timer counting down to 0. The black town car I had prearranged 3 weeks prior was idling exactly where I had calculated it would be, just beyond the glow of the country club's gas lanterns. The gravel of the driveway crunched under my heels, a steady, rhythmic sound that swallowed the faint strains of the string quartet bleeding through the ballroom's heavy oak doors. I did not look back. I did not check to see if Vance had followed me into the freezing November air. The physics of his cowardice dictated that he would currently be standing exactly where I left him, surrounded by 550 silent spectators, waiting for his father to tell him what to do next. I slid into the leather interior of the car. The heavy door closed with a muted, hermetic thud, instantly severing me from the Alden universe. The driver, a professional who knew better than to look in the rearview mirror, simply put the car in drive. The Mandarin Oriental, Manhattan, I said, my voice perfectly level. The city was a 45-minute drive. I spent the duration of it looking out the tinted window as the skeletal trees of the Connecticut suburbs gave way to the concrete arteries of the Bronx, and finally, the electric grid of the Manhattan skyline. I didn't cry. My hands, resting loosely in my lap, were not shaking. I raised my fingers, just once, to trace the contour of my left cheekbone. The skin was tight, radiating a dull, throbbing heat. A faint swelling was already beginning to alter the symmetry of my face. I didn't view it as an injury. I viewed it as a timestamp. A physical receipt of a transaction that had just finalized. By the time the elevator doors opened to my suite on the 52nd floor, it was approaching midnight. The room was a masterclass in sterile luxury, sweeping floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, muted charcoal carpets, and absolute, impenetrable silence. I walked directly to the bathroom. I turned on the faucet, watching the water cascade over the heavy chrome fixtures, and meticulously washed the gala off my skin. I dissolved the waterproof mascara, unpinned my hair, and let the heavy, dark navy gown pool on the heated marble floor. I slipped into the oversized, white terry cloth robe provided by the hotel, tied it tightly at my waist, and poured myself a glass of iced sparkling water. I took my laptop out of my bag, set it on the glass-topped desk facing the skyline, and opened the liquidation folder. While the Aldens were likely still at the country club, frantically doing damage control over spilled water and a public slap, an entirely different kind of machinery was silently powering up in the dark. Conrad Alden had always viewed contracts as mere suggestions, documents to be bullied out of, renegotiated, or ignored entirely through sheer force of will and expensive litigation. When he had secured the mezzanine loan from Apex Holdings LLC to save his failing Hudson Towers project, he hadn't bothered to scrutinize the microscopic print of the covenants. He had been too desperate for the cash and too arrogant to believe a faceless Delaware shell company could ever outmaneuver him. He didn't understand the anatomy of mezzanine debt. It is not a traditional mortgage. It is a loan secured not by the property itself, but by the equity of the holding company. If you default on a mortgage, the bank takes the building after a long, drawn-out foreclosure. If you default on a mezzanine loan, the lender executes a strict foreclosure. They bypass the property entirely and simply take the keys to the entire company. Overnight. But Conrad hadn't defaulted on a payment. He was perfectly current on his interest. The fatal flaw I had built into the architecture of that loan was far more elegant. It was buried on page 74 under Section 8, subsection D. A clause known in niche corporate law as a morals and public disrepute covenant. I called it Article 4. The legal phrasing was dense, algorithmic, and utterly lethal. Any public act, omission, or event involving a managing partner, guarantor, or their immediate familial dependents, which results in material public disgrace, widespread reputational damage, or severe compromise to the moral standing of the borrowing entity, shall constitute an immediate and incurable event of default, granting the lender the unilateral right to accelerate all outstanding principal and interest, due and payable, within 24 hours. Conrad had signed it without a second thought. Wealthy men never believe the rules of morality apply to their bank accounts. But tonight, in front of 550 of his most vital investors, creditors, and social peers, his son and named successor had physically struck his wife. It was not a private argument. It was a highly visible, undeniable act of public disgrace. A violent assault witnessed by the exact demographic that sustained the Alden Group's perceived stability. It was the absolute, textbook definition of a breach of Article 4. Miles away, in a dimly lit, oil-stained garage in Delaware, my father received my 3-word text message. I could picture the scene with the clarity of a high-definition photograph. Harrison would have been leaning over the engine block of a 1968 Mustang, the air heavy with the scent of raw gasoline and old leather. His hands, calloused and perpetually stained with graphite, would have reached into the pocket of his denim coveralls to retrieve his phone. He would have read the words "Initiate Article 4. He wouldn't have smiled. He wouldn't have cheered. He would have simply walked over to the deep industrial sink in the corner of his shop. He would have pressed the pump on the orange, grit-filled pumice soap, slowly and methodically scrubbing the grease from his knuckles, watching the dark water spiral down the drain. He would have dried his hands on a clean rag, walked into his small, cluttered office and opened a laptop that connected directly to a server in Wilmington. With clean hands, the mechanic sent a single, pre-drafted email to a team of 15 ruthless corporate litigators who billed at $2,000 an hour. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained one word: execute. I sat in the quiet of my hotel room, watching the headlights of the cars moving like tiny, slow-moving blood cells through the veins of the city below. The ice in my glass cracked, a sharp, sudden sound in the silent room. The first wave hit the Alden infrastructure at exactly 8:01 a.m. the following morning. I was sitting in a plush armchair by the window, wearing a cashmere sweater, drinking my first cup of black coffee. The tablet on my lap was synced to a hidden tracking software I had embedded in the Alden Group's central servers months ago. I didn't need to be in their offices to watch the oxygen get sucked out of the room. At 8:01 a.m., the electronic notices of default were simultaneously served to the Alden Group's executive inboxes, their registered agents, and directly to the compliance departments of their secondary banking partners. At 8:05 a.m., the automated cross-default clauses triggered. When a company is declared in default on a massive senior loan, every other minor creditor automatically assumes the company is insolvent. Their credit lines froze instantly. The corporate cards stopped working. The escrow accounts for the Hudson Towers project were legally padlocked. My phone, resting face up on the marble side table, vibrated. The screen illuminated, cutting through the morning shadows. Incoming call, Vance. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The roast was dark, acidic, and perfectly hot. I watched the phone buzz, inching fractionally across the smooth stone surface. It stopped. 10 seconds later, it started again. Incoming call, Vance. He would be pacing his office right now. The bespoke suit from the night before likely wrinkled, his breath probably still smelling of stale champagne and fresh panic. He had woken up expecting to deal with a difficult conversation about a divorce settlement. Instead, he had walked into a financial massacre. The phone stopped ringing. A moment later, a text message appeared. Meredith, please pick up. There's a massive misunderstanding with the Hudson accounts. The banks are locking us out. Where are you? We need to talk. I didn't reach for the device. I just watched the text sit there, a digital monument to his sheer, profound ignorance. He still didn't understand the geometry of the trap he was in. He still thought it was a bank error. He still thought he had leverage. 5 minutes later, the screen lit up again. This time, it wasn't Vance. Incoming call, Conrad Alden. The alpha male. The man who had mocked my father's dirty hands while drinking his imported wine. The man who had orchestrated my public humiliation to secure a diamond for a woman he deemed noble. His call was not a request for a conversation, it was a demand for obedience. I let it ring. I let the silence stretch out, thick and luxurious, filling the corners of the suite. The power of a closed loop is that you no longer have to participate in the chaos you created. The legal notice delivered to Conrad's desk gave him exactly 24 hours to cure the default. He needed to produce $280 million in liquid cash by tomorrow morning, or Apex Holdings would legally seize 100% of the voting shares in the Alden Group. He couldn't raise $200 right now, let alone $200 million. The gates had slammed shut. The water was rising. And I was sitting 52 stories above the flood, completely dry, listening to the magnificent sound of a skyscraper finally giving way to gravity. The second day of the liquidation began with the subtle, mechanical hum of the motorized blackout shades rising in my suite at the Mandarin Oriental. The heavy fabric ascended with a quiet whisper, slowly revealing a panoramic, unobstructed view of the Hudson River. The water below was a cold, bruised gray, churning silently beneath the morning mist. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling glass, wrapped in a thick, white hotel robe, holding a cup of room-service black coffee. The porcelain cup transferred a perfect, steady heat to my palms. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't play music. The absolute, hermetic silence of the 52nd floor was the most exquisite soundtrack I had ever experienced. On the glass coffee table behind me, resting precisely in the center of a stack of unread architecture magazines, lay my phone. It was completely silent, yet visually, it was screaming. The screen would illuminate in a harsh, bright flare, vibrating soundlessly against the glass, casting a pale glow onto the ceiling, only to go dark a minute later. Then, almost immediately, the cycle would repeat. I didn't answer. I didn't even walk over to look at the caller ID. I simply stood by the window, sipping my coffee, watching the microscopic ferries navigate the currents of the river far below. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, the missed call counter on my home screen read 47. 47 times Vance had reached out into the void, expecting the safety net of his wife to be there to catch his plummeting reality. I didn't listen to the audio of his voicemails. Hearing the frantic fluctuation of his pitch, the desperate intake of his breath, would have assigned a level of humanity to him that he had permanently forfeited the moment his hand struck my face. Instead, I used a premium dictation software to transcribe his voice notes into plain text. Reading his panic in stark, black and white, 12-point Helvetica font removed all the emotion. It reduced his despair to raw, manageable data. The progression of the transcripts was a fascinating study in the psychology of a crumbling narcissist. The first few messages, left shortly after the corporate accounts were frozen, were steeped in his usual, unearned arrogance. Transcript 01842 a.m. Meredith, pick up the phone. This silent treatment is pathetic. There is a clerical error with the Hudson escrow. The bank is being ridiculous. Stop sulking about last night and call me back. He still believed he was the center of the universe. He still believed last night was merely a domestic dispute, a minor social faux pas that could be smoothed over with a Cartier bracelet and a passive-aggressive apology. By early afternoon, the tone had shifted. The Alden Group's CFO had likely finished tracing the origin of the default notice. They had looked past the dummy corporations, past the blind trusts, and found the singular, unmovable bedrock of my father's name. Transcript 14:15 p.m. What did you do? My father's lawyers are saying the mezzanine debt is held by Harrison. Your dad? A mechanic? That's impossible. Call him off, Meredith. Do you have any idea what you're destroying? You're destroying our lives. Notice the pronoun shift. When the empire was thriving, it was their legacy, their bloodline. Now that the building was on fire, it was suddenly our lives. While Vance was spiraling into a vortex of missed calls, Conrad was fighting a completely different, entirely invisible war. I sat on the plush sofa, my laptop balanced on my knees, tracking the digital footprint of Conrad's desperation. For 30 years, Conrad Alden had operated under the assumption that the law was a flexible concept, something that could be bent by a strategic phone call to a judge or a generous donation to a senator's re-election campaign. He spent the entirety of the second day burning through his social capital. I could see the digital pings of his panicked emails to the board members of Chase, his frantic attempts to secure an emergency bridge loan from his country club associates. But wealth is notoriously cowardly. The moment the scent of blood hit the water, his elite circle vanished. No one was going to lend $280 million to a man who had triggered a morals clause default in front of half the tri-state area's financial sector. Conrad hit a brick wall built of Delaware corporate law. My father's contracts were not drawn up by high society fixers, they were engineered by legal assassins who specialized in hostile, airtight acquisitions. There were no loopholes. There was no grace period. The contract didn't care what country club Conrad belonged to or who his grandfather had played golf with. It only recognized the cold, unfeeling mathematics of the default. As the sun began to set on the second day, casting long, bruised shadows of purple and charcoal across the Manhattan skyline, the transcripts from Vance turned from anger to pure, unadulterated begging. Transcript 32:11:45 p.m. Meredith, please. I'm sorry. Okay. I'm so sorry about last night. I was drunk. My dad put me up to it with Victoria. I swear to God I didn't want any of this. Please, just answer. They're going to take the company. They're going to take the Westport house. I have nothing. I am begging you. I read the words on the glowing screen. I felt the pulse in my wrist, steady, slow, unbothered. I dragged the text files into the encrypted folder labeled liquidation. The third morning arrived with the pale, anemic light of a late autumn dawn. Today was the deadline. The 72-hour window was closing. I ordered breakfast at exactly 7:30. A single poached egg, dry sourdough toast, and a fresh pot of Darjeeling tea. I sat at the small dining table near the window. The silver cutlery felt heavy and perfectly balanced in my hands. I poured the tea, watching the steam curl elegantly into the cool air of the room. The quiet was absolute. I didn't need to look at the clock. At exactly 8:01 a.m., the exact minute the 24-hour cure period expired, my laptop chimed. A single, crisp notification sound. It was an email from the lead litigator representing Apex Holdings. The subject line was simply the case file number. I set my teacup down, the china making a soft clink against the saucer. I opened the email. There was no congratulatory message. There was no emotional narrative. There was only a 2-sentence confirmation and a secured PDF attachment. Ms. Alden, the cure period has expired without capital resolution. The immediate transfer of 100% of the voting shares, physical assets, and corporate holdings of the Alden Group to Apex Holdings LLC has been successfully executed. I clicked the attachment. I scrolled through the dense legalese, the notarized digital signatures, the definitive transfer of power. Conrad's entire life's work, the century-old legacy he had used as a weapon to bludgeon my self-worth, was now legally the property of the man who changed his oil. My phone, resting on the desk across the room, vibrated one final time. I stood up, my bare feet sinking into the thick carpet. I walked over and looked down at the screen. Incoming call, Vance. I didn't decline the call. Declining is an action. It is a response. It tells the caller you are there, that you are actively choosing to reject them. I simply reached out, placed my index finger on the edge of the device, and flipped it face down against the cold glass. I let it ring out into the silence. They had spent 3 years trying to teach me my place. They had bought me aprons, mocked my lineage, and slapped me in front of hundreds of people to prove how small I was. But as I looked out over the vast, gray expanse of the water, knowing that the Alden family was currently waking up to zeroed-out accounts and locked corporate doors, I finally understood the true nature of power. Power doesn't yell. Power doesn't need to throw a glass or strike a face to make itself known. Power is the ability to sit in an empty room, completely silent, and watch the world you designed crush the people who thought they owned you. The scent of my father's garage in Wilmington, Delaware, was an olfactory tapestry woven from decades of honest labor. It smelled of heavy 10W30 motor oil, oxidized metal, damp concrete, and the faint, sweet tang of old leather upholstery. It was a complex, grounding aroma that no luxury candle from Diptyque could ever replicate. It was a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 6 months since the night I walked out of the ballroom in Connecticut. I was sitting on a scuffed, red vinyl stool near the main workbench. I wore a pair of faded denim jeans and a simple gray cotton t-shirt. My laptop, a sleek slab of silver aluminum, rested next to a heavy, cast-iron bench vise. I was running the quarterly risk projections for Apex Holdings, casually cross-referencing the municipal tax codes for Manhattan's commercial district. 10 feet away from me, my father, Harrison, was lying on a wooden mechanic's creeper, slid halfway beneath the chassis of a midnight blue 1968 Shelby GT500. The rhythmic, metallic click of his socket wrench echoed through the cavernous space, a steady, metronomic beat that felt like the true pulse of our family. He didn't speak much when he worked. He communicated with the machinery, feeling the tension of the bolts, understanding the exact pressure required to secure a foundation. I scrolled through the PDF document on my screen. It was the finalized asset transition report for the property formerly known as Hudson Towers. The Alden Group was no longer an active corporate entity, it was a closed file in the archives of a bankruptcy court. When Apex Holdings executed the strict foreclosure, it triggered an avalanche that Conrad Alden's fragile ego simply could not hold back. The mezzanine debt was merely the first domino. Once the primary lenders saw that Conrad had lost controlling interest of his own flagship company, they called in the secondary personal loans he had collateralized with his own lifestyle. It is a fascinating psychological study to watch a man whose entire identity is tied to his net worth suddenly realize his net worth is a negative integer. Conrad didn't fight gracefully. According to the updates from our legal team, he spent the first 2 months threatening everyone from his former golfing partners to the presiding federal judge. He fired 3 different defense attorneys when they gently tried to explain the absolute, airtight finality of Delaware corporate law. When the reality finally set in, the collapse was total. The sprawling, sterile estate in Westport with the imported marble and the silent, 68-degree rooms was auctioned off to a tech billionaire from California who immediately gutted the interior. Evelyn's collection of antique silverware, the very cutlery she used to demean me during Sunday dinners, was liquidated to satisfy back taxes. They were currently residing in a leased, 2-bedroom condominium in a highly unremarkable suburb of New Jersey. Evelyn, I imagined, was learning the harsh, unfamiliar choreography of navigating a public grocery store without an assistant. "Hand me the half-inch drive, would you, Mayor?" My father's voice drifted out from under the heavy steel frame of the Shelby. It was a calm, gravelly baritone. I looked up from my screen, scanned the meticulously organized red tool chest, picked up the cold, heavy socket wrench, and walked over to the car. I knelt on the concrete and slid the tool across the floor until his grease-stained hand caught it. "Got it," he grunted, the clicking of the wrench resuming its steady rhythm. I stood back up, but I didn't return to my laptop immediately. I stayed there, watching the sheer mechanical integrity of the work he was doing. My father's hands were stained with graphite and oil, the knuckles thick and calloused from a lifetime of shaping reality with brute force and precision. Conrad had looked at those hands and seen dirt. I looked at those hands and saw the very architecture of power. And then there was Vance. I didn't actively seek out information on my ex-husband, but in the modern digital age, data always finds a way to surface. A few weeks ago, an automated algorithm on a professional networking site suggested him as a connection you might know. The profile picture was no longer a professionally lit headshot in a bespoke Brioni suit. It was a poorly cropped photo taken against a beige wall. His title was no longer Executive Vice President of the Alden Group. He was now listed as a junior leasing associate for a mid-tier, regional commercial real estate firm in Queens. The details painted a vivid, pathetic picture. He was 34 years old, working an entry-level position under a regional manager who was likely 5 years his junior. He was making cold calls, trying to lease unremarkable office space in strip malls, earning a base salary that wouldn't have covered the tax on the Graf diamond he had tried to purchase for Victoria. And Victoria, true to the predictable algorithms of generational wealth, had vanished the exact moment the Alden corporate accounts were frozen. The noble future of their lineage had promptly returned the ring and engaged herself to a hedge fund manager before the Westport house had even hit the auction block. Loyalty, in their world, was merely a transaction pending sufficient funds. The clicking of the socket wrench stopped. My father grabbed the side of the creeper and rolled himself out from under the car. He sat up, wiping his forehead with the back of his forearm. His denim coveralls were smeared with dark grease, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent, were entirely at peace. He stood up, walked over to the deep industrial sink in the corner, and pressed the pump on the orange pumice soap. I watched him scrub his hands, the gritty soap breaking down the oil, the water spiraling down the drain. It was the same ritual he performed the night I sent him the 3-word text message. The ritual of cleaning up a mess. He dried his hands on a blue shop towel, walked over to a battered coffee maker sitting on a dusty shelf, and poured 2 cups of black coffee into white styrofoam cups. He walked back to the workbench and handed one to me. Engine's breathing right again, he said simply, taking a slow sip from his cup. He looked at the Shelby, then looked at my laptop screen, which was still displaying the liquidation totals of the Alden Empire. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't offer a dramatic speech about justice or karma. We were analysts, the two of us. We understood that the universe doesn't have a moral arc, it only has cause and effect. A poorly engineered structure will eventually fall. We just happen to be the gravity. It looks good on paper, I replied, taking a sip of the bitter, scalding coffee. It tasted infinitely better than the vintage champagne at the country club. A foundation has to be solid, Mayor, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the gleaming chrome bumper of the car. You build on sand, you don't get to act surprised when the tide comes in. I nodded, feeling the warmth of the cup in my hands, feeling the steady, rhythmic beating of my own heart. I thought about the 550 guests at that gala. I thought about the deafening silence that followed the slap, the collective breath they held, waiting for me to shatter. People think power is loud. They think it wears a tailored suit, yells in boardrooms, and asserts dominance by striking those smaller than them. But true power is hidden in how quiet you can stay when a storm breaks. True power is the discipline to not react to the insult, but to meticulously dismantle the very ground the insulter is standing on. The Aldens loved calling me lower class. They were right. We were lower class. We were the foundation. And when the foundation is quietly, deliberately pulled, it took exactly 72 hours for them to learn how fast the palaces built on top of it collapse. If this reminded you of a room you needed to walk out of, share this video, subscribe, and drop a comment. I'll see you in the next story.